I was out in the garden earlier today looking at the 3 rows of beets I'd planted and thinking that maybe I'd overdone it with the beets a little bit this year. I do like the beets because they seem to grow fast and easy, and also because I like to eat both their greens and their roots. Eat the greens raw in a salad or boil them up, and same with the roots. And I even thought that maybe if I got overwhelmed with beets this year, I might even get into pickling them because I do love a good pickled beet. But looking at all the beets, I was wishing I'd replaced 1 row of them with turnips instead, just for some variety. And then I got to thinking about the difference between a beet and a turnip. And they're kind of similar in some ways in that you can eat the greens and the root, but the one difference is you can make a good mash with the turnips. And then I was thinking about whether you could mash beets, and imagining all that blood red juice squirting out, I thought about how one big difference is that you can't squeeze blood from a turnip, but that you sure can from a beet. And then I wondered that maybe if that idiom, can't squeeze blood from a turnip, had its origins in this difference between beets and turnips, two otherwise similar vegetables. So I thought that this would be an interesting thing to explore in this episode, along with some other vegetable idioms. So welcome to Idiom America, the podcast that keeps looking at idioms. Those bits of non-straightforward language that give a language color and richness and roots to the past. So let's look at that first root, the turnip. I knew that turnips were cousins to radishes and mustards, and that a variety of turnips were called rutabagas, Swedes or Swedish turnips. But what I didn't know was that bok choy and Chinese cabbage were actually varieties of turnips as well, ones that are grown just for the leaves with shallow roots. So it turns out that I did plant some turnips this year, as I planted a row of bok choy for the first time, and now that it's starting to go to seed, I can really see the resemblance with turnips and mustard. At any rate, the turnip we're all probably most familiar with is the white turnip that has an above ground part that turns purple from exposure to the sun, kind of like those with white skin get sunburned. And I assume that it's this classic white turnip with a purple top that was in the mind of whoever it was that came up with that idiom, you can't squeeze blood from a turnip, which means, of course, that you can't get something, often money, out of someone or something who simply doesn't have it to give. My first thought was that maybe this idiom had something to do with that purple top, which is kind of deceiving, in that if you just look at a turnip sitting there in the ground with that purple top poking up, you might think that there are some purple juices to follow, but no matter how hard you squeeze, there's not. The origin of this one isn't too clear, as there's not a whole lot out there on the internet about it. So I did some digging, and the first use of it I could find using a Google's book search was from 1801, from the Spirit of the Public Journals for 1800, from a tongue-in-cheek article called Rules of Health, where an editor lays out all these rules of health, like to bloodlet, let some of your juices out now and again, and to live low and also live high. Or drink lots of water and also drink lots of good old port. And a reader responds to these rules by telling the editor, "Now, Mr. Editor, to adopt all these recommendations would be unwise, for nothing is more plain than that they must counteract each other." And then he goes on to say that at any rate, there are only 2 of the health prescriptions that he can follow, which is to live low and drink lots of water, because he can afford nothing else. And then he goes on to say, "For the last 15 years I have been condemned to live, or rather indeed to starve, upon the half pay of an ensign. And to say the truth, for this or any other season, to take any juices from me would be like taking blood from a turnip, or, if I may use so tried an observation, robbing a Highlander of a knee buckle." The fact that this is the first use of the phrase I can find, along with the fact that it doesn't put the phrase blood from a turnip in quotation marks like it does the trite observation, robbing a Highlander of a knee buckle, leads me to believe that this idiom really wasn't in use at the time. And the next use of it I can find is from 1802 in a poem submitted to the European magazine. And the poem itself is about the struggle to write a poem, how everybody in those days seemed to be writing poems. "All the world now write poems, and why should not I? Let me fail or succeed, I'm determined to try." The modern day equivalent might be podcasts, huh? So the would-be poet tries plumbing the depths of Virgil and Homer and Milton, and trying out odes and satires and sonnets, but finding it really tough going. And so the poem ends with this. So at last, like the smith who was pleased in spite of the muses, I scribbled off this. And having been taught what I knew not before, shall try to squeeze blood from a turnip no more. And after that, you really don't see this idiom popping up with any regularity until the 1820s. So I think this is a pretty good source as the origin here, and it was probably spreading mostly word of mouth until then, I guess. Anyway, pretty deep dive on this idiom, but it's kind of fun sometimes when you see an idiom that hasn't been really explored much on the internet to feel like you're contributing your own little bit of original research, not just synthesizing and repacking what's already out there, although that has a value of its own. But before moving on, I should probably mention that there's a similar idiom out there that means the same thing. Can't get blood from a stone, or can't squeeze blood from a stone. But since the theme of this episode is vegetables, I won't explore that one further. The humble turnip's not the most popular vegetable out there, idiom-wise and otherwise. So the only other turnip idiom I can turn up is fall off the turnip truck, as in he just fell off the turnip truck, which is, of course, means naive, uninformed, unsophisticated, in the manner of a rustic rural person, provincial, a yokel, bumpkin, hayseed, hick, country mouse. Kind of surprisingly, this one didn't show up until the mid-1970s when it started popping up in a variety of different contexts all at once. Hard to say why. It probably has something to do with the fact that it's alliterative. It's just kind of fun to say turnip truck. And this was a favorite expression of Johnny Carson as well. And it's just a great image of somebody from a rural area riding into town, perched on top of a mound of turnips, kind of like those Beverly Hillbillies coming into L.A., and the fact that it's easy to pick on the turnip is an example of poor peasant food, something that's often fed to livestock, just adds to it. And a similar idiom here in the U.S., that, as a nation of immigrants, is to just get off the boat or fresh off the boat. And there, instead of the old urban-rural divide and the image of some slick urban sophisticate fleecing a bewildered rube from the sticks, you have the idea of a new immigrant not yet well adapted or assimilated to the new culture. And another variation is to have just fallen off the cabbage truck, but this one just doesn't have the same ring to me. But there are a couple examples of turnips and cabbages playing the same lowly role in speech. Just like you can call somebody a cabbage-head, meaning a thick-witted person, you can just as easily call them a turnip-head. And speaking of turnip heads, just as an aside, jack-o'-lanterns were actually once made of turnips. Instead of carving pumpkins for Halloween, people would carve turnips, and they were sometimes called ghost turnips. And they were complete with those craggy teeth and sinister eye slits, and they could be quite spooky. They were more popular in Ireland, where pumpkins weren't common, but it's harder to hollow out a turnip than a pumpkin, so that's probably one reason you don't see them as much. And one idiom I'd never heard before until I was looking at these cabbage ones is, I don't boil my cabbage twice, or I don't chew my cabbage twice. And it means that you don't repeat yourself. Sorry, can you repeat? Nope, I don't boil my cabbage twice. And apparently there's an old Irish proverb, there's no use in boiling your cabbage twice, meaning to stop going over and over worries in your head because it solves nothing. So that may be the origin of this one. And then there's another one I hadn't heard of. I'm not so green as cabbage looking, which is apparently more popular in the UK, and it means that you're not as naive or foolish as you might look, or it might be expected. So from a newspaper in Scotland in 1876, you get somebody saying, "We are very far north indeed, sir, but we are not so green as we are cabbage looking." And I think this is just a playful way of mixing the different associations of green and cabbage to mean naive and rural or peasant-like in a way that doesn't make much sense on its face, like a lot of idioms, I suppose. And that association of rural with vegetables carries over to corn too, as you get something like cornfed that can mean to have a well-fed, healthy, and guileless appearance, the open enthusiasm of these handsome corn-fed youngsters, but that can also mean sheltered or uncultured, corn-fed hillbilly. And a variation on this one is cornbread, as in congressional candidates from the big city tend to overlook the cornbread out in the boonies. Another alternative meaning of cornfed ties into the idiom-ish word corny, as it can mean rustically wholesome or corny, like corn-fed humor. And according to Merriam-Webster's, corny means mawkishly old-fashioned, tiresomely simple and sentimental. That seemed a little harsh to me and not really capturing the dad joke, makes you groan, earnest, playful sort of connotation of corny I had in my mind. So I looked up mawkishly, and that's defined as lacking flavor or having an unpleasant taste, exaggeratedly or childishly emotional. And that's getting closer to it, I think, something sappy and maudlin, sure, but there's a kind of wholesome goodness about something corny, a kind of corn-fed quality, if you will, that's lacking here in this definition for me. Or maybe something of the cornball quality. Webster's, again, defines cornball as an unsophisticated person, as well as corny in the sense of trite or sentimental. But I think there's some positive quality in the lack of cynicism or being overly concerned about appearing sophisticated that's not being captured by these dictionary definitions of cornball and corny. Hokey, on the other hand, that to me has all the negative qualities implied by corny without any of the positive. As an example from Billboard in April of 2023. Around 10 years ago, Horn was approached by the Opry Entertainment Group to write the book for a musical based on Hee Haw, the Hokey variety show that ran from 1969 to 1991 and mixed country music with groan-worthy skits, often set in a cornfield. In fact, if you've ever seen Hee Haw, it's a pretty good example all around of a lot of these corny and corn-fed and cornball idioms, as well as turnip trucks and cabbage heads, etc. So I wonder if that show, which was often set in the cornfield, had something to do with popularizing these corn ones. Moving on to carrots. The classic one there is the carrot and stick, as in the carrot and stick approach, where you can dangle somebody a carrot or offer them the carrot or threaten or hit them with a stick. And I'd always assumed that this one comes from the practice of urging a donkey or horse to move forward by hanging a carrot in front of it, and then if it refuses to move, hitting it with a stick. You know, the kind of thing you'd see in cartoons growing up. And this is, of course, a metaphor for the use of a combination of a reward and punishment to induce a desired behavior. In politics specifically, carrot or stick sometimes refers to the realist concept of soft and hard power, and the carrot in this context would be the promise of economic or diplomatic aid, while the stick might be the threat of military action. And this idiom first popped up in the mid-19th century from authors who were indeed referring to caricatures or cartoons depicting a race between donkey riders, with the losing jockey using the strategy of beating his steed with blackhorn twigs to urge it forward, while the winner of the race sits in his saddle relaxing and holding the butt end of his baited stick, which was usually a carrot. Although in some oral traditions, turnips were used instead of carrots as the donkey's temptation, so we almost got ourselves another turnip idiom, although the turnip and stick approach doesn't quite have the same appeal. And then decades later, the idea appeared in a letter from Winston Churchill dated July 6, 1938. Thus, by every device, from the stick to the carrot, the emaciated Austrian donkey is made to pull the Nazi barrow up an ever-steepening hill. And then it was until the late 1940s when this idiom started to show up in the U.S. And you'd think there'd be more idioms with carrots, since they're not only such a staple food, but they're one that does show up in a lot of cartoons. Think of Bugs Bunny munching on a carrot. But the only other one I can come up with is like peas and carrots, meaning to get along very well, be compatible. You guys have such similar interests, I just knew you'd be like peas and carrots. And there's a famous use of this one in Forrest Gump.
From that day on, we was always together. Jenny and me was like peas and carrots.
This one probably comes from that classic side dish of peas and carrots cooked together. And this was always one of my favorites. I remember my mom would cook this one with a little milk and butter. Maybe add some thyme or dill or some sauteed onion in there. You can't go wrong. A similar one to that, peas and carrots, is like peas in a pod or 2 peas in a pod. And this is probably the oldest of the idioms we've looked at today, dating back to at least the 1500s. And it means, of course, to be closely similar, almost indistinguishable. Usually in appearance or looks, but also character or interests or anything really. And there's probably nothing more to the origin of this one than the fact that if you open up a pot of peas, they look pretty similar. A couple more peas ones here quickly are easy as shelling peas, meaning as easy as cake or as easy as pie. And thick as pea soup, used to describe a heavy and thick fog. We had some light fog here in DC this morning, but nobody would describe it as of the pea soup variety. All right, this talk of yummy veggies is making me hungry, and I'm about idiomed out for now. So, in the words of the great anonymous poet of 1802, and having been taught what I knew not before, shall try to squeeze blood from a turnip no more.